For having me here. It's a real honor, a real pleasure to come here tonight to speak with you. For the fact that we're here on a Friday night, I will hope to make this both entertaining and engaging and actually have quite a bit of crowd interaction. The title of my lecture is Culture Wars in the Classroom, Bridging the Ideological Divide with Comparative History. If we could have an alternate title for this, I guess the alternate title would be How a Kid from a Small Town in Michigan ended up in southern Utah, scared out of his mind, teaching a bunch of Mormon kids, and somehow ended up getting Teacher of the Year, his first year here. I was scared to death about it. I'm still not sure how I pulled it off, but I'll see if I can share my experiences with you tonight, and even if you're from different disciplines, hopefully get something out of it. The one person I'd like to start off with talking about tonight, and to be quite honest, the thing that scared me the most is coming to southern Utah. As Aaron said, I'm notorious on our campus at both trying to reach out to students on the far left and on the far right and try and find some common ground. But particularly coming from the Midwest and coming here as an academic, I was a little bit intimidated by this man. I'm sure we're all familiar with Glenn Beck, but coming from the Academy, let's remind ourselves of some opinions that Glenn Beck has about both the Academy and intellectuals in general. Share a few quotes here from Glenn Beck where he says, quote, "We've been working for a couple weeks now on a special on the indoctrination of your children. Gang, you have a system that's wildly out of control, and they are capturing your kids. As Van Jones himself had said, the earlier we make this adjustment with the youth, the easier the transaction is going to be. No, the teacher can help. The teacher knows better than you. Mom, stand guard, America. Your republic's under attack." I'm sorry, I'm going to try and step away from it. Can people still hear me okay? I can't stand microphones here. So, if I end up not projecting well enough, I actually started off as a theater major years ago. I think I can pull off the projection in this room, but bear with me here. One of my problems here with Glenn Beck comes to the last part there. This idea that somehow, by talking about different ideas that compete with Glenn Beck's own values, somehow your republic is under attack. According to Glenn Beck, it's not just the republic being under attack, but intellectuals by our very nature now are somehow un-American and helping to assist terrorists. If you look at this quote, he says, "I have news for you. There's a lot of universities out there that are just as dangerous with indoctrination of your children as these terror groups are in Iran or North Korea. America, while you've been working hard, while you've been busting your butt, while you thought we all generally agreed on things, we've been setting up re-education centers. We call them universities." Now my problem when it comes to academics and when it comes to trying to bridge the gap here in the culture wars is not just with the right, but also with the left. Years ago I was introduced to this folk singer by the name of Utah Phillips. And a number of people I grew up with were great fans of Utah Phillips, and they used to like to talk history with me concerning Utah Phillips. One thing I respect about Utah Phillips is he brings a unique voice to history, but he also thinks he skews things a lot when it comes to the left. We look at this quote from a Utah Phillips song. He says, quote, "When I went to high school, that's about as far as I got, reading my U.S. history textbooks. Well, I got the history of the ruling class. I got the history of the generals and the industrialists and the presidents who didn't get caught. How about you? I got the history of the people who owned the wealth of the country, but none of the history of the people who created it. You know, so when I went out to get my first job, I went out armed with somebody else's class background. And that was deliberate, wasn't it?" Well, I think Utah brings up some good points about education. He makes it sound like a conspiracy theory. I would argue why you don't hear a lot of these stories when you're in a high school history classroom. It's because your high school history teacher doesn't have the time to tell all those stories. It's not some kind of conspiracy of the right to try and indoctrinate you into class values. You just don't have the time when you're a high school educator. He goes on with this and says, "They didn't want me to know this. That's why this stuff isn't taught in the history textbooks. We're not supposed to know it. Understand that. Now, if I wanted the true history of where I came from, as a member of the working class, I had to go to my elders. They gave me a history that's more profound, more beautiful, more powerful, more passionate, and ultimately more useful than the best damn history book I ever read." Now, I like the end of that statement, because I'm really into oral history, and most of the lessons I've learned in life with history have been sitting down and talking with people, not reading history textbooks. But I can assure you, I have an office full of history textbooks that cover every single subject you can imagine possible. For Utah Phillips to say that the history books don't cover this stuff, and that it's a conspiracy, well, it's just not true. One of the other problems to think about with this, and trying to reach out to kids nowadays, has to do with both motivation and with critical thinking. Because a couple of the heroes that are out there now, I'm sure you're well aware of them, Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin. If you look at this quote from Homer Simpson, I think it says a lot about the attitude of some youth in this generation, where he says, Lisa, if you don't like your job, you don't strike, you just go in every day and do it really half-assed. That's the American way. And I know a lot of kids in my classes who would adopt that attitude of Homer Simpson. The other problem, though, what scares me most, is less the Homer Simpson attitude and more Peter Griffin from Family Guy. One of my favorite quotes from Peter Griffin is he says, "Yes, I believe in everything everyone tells me, all of the time." What I'll share with you is a couple of experiences I've had in the last few years, of things that helped to trigger me into trying to change the way I educate my students. Because there's been a number of things that have gone on with the culture wars over the last few years that quite blatantly have infuriated me as an academic, but also scared me as an academic, trying to step into that classroom. A few years ago, there was a film released called Indoctrinate You, which was trying to expose the left-wing academy and this conspiracy here against America. The young man writes at the end of this documentary, says, "Academics promote sympathy with enemies of the United States. It's no surprise that the American flag was not welcome on college campuses after 9/11. Dorm residents at Central Michigan University were told to remove American flags from the doors. Liberal academics really only want freedom of speech for their own speech. But this is a war worth winning. Until then, remember these words: no justice, no peace." It's a call to arms to tell a student to come into that classroom to disrupt that classroom. And one of my problems with that, when he talks about Central Michigan University, that university is the hometown that I grew up in. I grew up 5 blocks away from that place. I lived in Mount Pleasant during 9/11. Let me tell you, there was flag ceremonies every night. The example that he brings out is because there was one student who put up a flag on his dorm room, and next to it had pictures of Muslims being hung and their bodies set on fire. So the administrator said, that's inappropriate. But this kid took that one example and completely skewed the situation. And it scares me every day to have people like that, to say to my students, no justice, no peace. Because that's not what my classroom's about. I had an experience my very first semester at Dixie State as well. One of the great things about Dixie State is we have a number of retired people who come back to our college and are able to audit classes. When you're able to connect with these students, it's an absolute pleasure working with them. But I had one particular student who had missed the first 2 weeks of class, decided he wanted to bump into my class, and had no idea what my class was all about. When he saw that I had a book by a historian by the name of Howard Zinn, this man started shouting on his first day of class. And what he said to me is, he says, "Everyone knows that academics are just a bunch of liberal liars. This guy assigned Howard Zinn. This book is communist trash, and you should not listen to a word your professor has to say. It's all just propaganda." So I said back to the gentleman, I said, "Sir, will you please change your tone? My classroom is about dialogue, and you're disrupting that atmosphere." Remember, my class had already been going on for 2 weeks. He went on to say, "No, Glenn Beck told me to speak up, and you will not silence me." And despite the fact that the man was 65 years old, I silenced him and asked him to leave. And the 17-year-olds and the 18-year-olds in the class, who had already been there for a couple of weeks and understood what my class was about, very much appreciated it. Because an attitude like that, whether it's from the left or from the right, is destructive when it comes to education. Because what we do in my class, and the way I try and bridge things here, when it comes to the culture wars in the classroom, is utilizing comparative history. What I do instead of using traditional U.S. history textbooks is I intentionally use a book from a far left perspective and a far right perspective, and have students read selections from both books and let them make up their minds on their own. This first book you've probably heard of before. Very famous historian by the name of Howard Zinn in the mid-'80s wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. What Howard Zinn attempted to do with this book was look at what he called history from below. He wanted to tell the history of Native Americans not from the perspective of white settlers, but from Native Americans. He essentially always tries to talk about the underdog. He says what he's trying to do is essentially diversify the way we've traditionally talked about history. For the fact that this is an incredibly left-wing textbook. About 10 years ago, one of my good friends, Larry Schweiker, wrote a rebuttal called A Patriot's History of the United States. It's a very conservative textbook, you can tell by the title. And what Larry does is he looks at what I would call history from above. He tells you the story about presidents, industrialists, great leaders. It's an absolutely fantastic book. But the problem is, if you only have access to one of these books, I would argue you're not getting a full education. And what I try and do in that classroom then is both of these guys had an agenda, a political agenda in writing these books. And I disagree with both of these guys, because according to Howard Zinn believes if you take his book and put it in the hands of a young conservative, that they're going to go out the next day and probably join the Socialist Party. I think Howard's wrong. At the same time, Larry Schweiker, he thinks that if a young leftist reads his book, well, he's going to go out and join the Tea Party. I disagree with both of these guys, because what I say is if you put Howard Zinn's book in the hands of a young conservative, it helps him to understand the mind of somebody on the left and how to better effectively argue with that person. You understand how they think and the evidence that they use. And the argument I'd say with Larry Schweiker, you put a conservative book in the hands of a young liberal, all of a sudden you're introduced to the mind of a conservative and how that person thinks, how that person talks. And what I argue in my classroom, and what's happened over and over, is the exact opposite of what both of these men hope for. Because both of them think that they can win somebody over from the other side. What I've seen over and over is the exact opposite. As a young conservative who reads Howard Zinn becomes a better conservative, and a young liberal who reads Larry Schweiker becomes a better liberal. And what we do in my classroom is we try to have what I call the courtroom of history. Because if you're not aware of this, most history majors, unless they go on to become teachers, one of the other things they oftentimes do is they go off to law school. Because what historians do is essentially the same thing as lawyers. We look at something that happened in the past, we collect evidence, we try and form a convincing argument about it. What my students do every week is I assign selections from both of these textbooks. And they have to write a one-page response every week, treating each of those textbooks and those historians as a lawyer. That the textbooks they're providing is the evidence in a courtroom. And they, as a student, get to be the juror and decide who's providing the most convincing arguments that week. What we're going to see by comparing contrasting evidence and using that assignment as a jury deliberation. What students get to do is they get to see the arguments from the far left, the far right, see what evidence is used by each of these groups, and figure things out for themselves. And what oftentimes happens is they'll switch back and forth throughout the semester. Some weeks they'll be quite convinced by Howard Zinn, other weeks they'll see right through Howard Zinn and they'll side with Larry Schweiker. And it's a constant dialogue that's going to be going on in my classroom. I believe by exposing to extremes, it helps students be critical of both and decide for themselves what they think is the most convincing argument. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to share a couple of different things. Number one, a few different things about my course philosophy and how my course is set up. Because from day number one, students come in. I tell them exactly what they're getting into. If you look at some stuff here for my course syllabus, I state, history is not a chronology of random events and meaningless cycles. History is the essence of the human experience that gives meaning to civilization, culture, and morality. Evidence, facts, and stories are the tools utilized by historians, but debate is the foundation of the historian's craft. The past is anything that happened before the present. History is the scientific method of studying the human past through verifiable evidence. For example, our texts are written by professional historians utilizing scientific research methods, yet they each tell a very different story of our nation's past. Just as two witnesses to any event will have different perspectives that change over time, historians very rarely agree on all points. Yet as social scientists, they're sharing true stories from various views. The goal of my methodology is not to challenge a student's prior beliefs or values. By studying opposing beliefs, students in turn sharpen their individual sense of self and build upon the existing strengths of their core values. This course is designed to deepen a student's critical thinking skills, equip them with diverse sources of evidence, and inspire active citizenship within our democracy. Because here's my fear with the culture wars, is we spend so much time yelling at each other, and pointing fingers at each other, and debating each other, that there's no dialogue. And I think that situation is incredibly poisonous for a democracy. We try and engage that issue in my classroom and see if we can overcome that. Something else that I try and keep in mind here is trying to define exactly what the historical method is and what it isn't. One of the first things we talk about is the past versus history. Because just because something's happened in the past does not necessarily mean that it's history. Because one of the things historians need as social scientists is we need documents, we need evidence. If we don't have that, we can't technically qualify it as history. I talk to my students saying the past is not history. The past may be lost without a trace. The past may be remembered, continually reinvented, or imagined as story. The past may be a reasonably true account or utilized as useful fiction. The past happened. How we use or remember it varies. And the example I always try and give with this is in the classroom. If you talk about useful fictions, can anyone tell me, what was George Washington most famous for when he was a little kid? Chopping down a cherry tree. Did George Washington ever actually chop down a cherry tree? Did he ever tell a lie? George Washington never told lies. He's a politician, I'm sorry. But does it really matter that we have these useful fictions? Does it really change your perspective on things to learn that somehow George Washington didn't chop down that cherry tree, and that the guy, well, he's a human being, so he probably told a lie at least a couple times in his life. There are useful fictions within our society, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we try and talk about here is we also talk about the aspect of history being a social science. One of the things, and I've talked with Larry about this over and over before with his book, one of the ways that Larry sells his book very well, I'm very jealous of him. He's found on the New York Times bestseller list. I think my own books maybe sold 5 copies. I think 4 of the 5 were relevant as being nice. I'd like to be on the New York Times bestseller list. And the front of his book, Larry's got an interview with Rush Limbaugh. And there's a quote in this interview where he says, quote, "I know liberals go nuts when you talk about whether certain people were put in place by God. George Washington was set in that office by God himself, because no other human being could have done that job." What I do after I share this quote is I ask my students, quite honestly, to raise their hands and say, how many of you agree with this quote? And you know what? At Dixie State College, about 90% of the kids will raise their hands. And what I say to them, I says, that's okay. I don't have a problem with you agreeing with that. But I said, what we have to differentiate here is history. And we go back to our definition. I said that history is, quote, a social science that records, analyzes, and interprets past events through a systematic evaluation of verifiable evidence. So if we go back here to Larry's quote, what would be the problem qualifying that as history? Does anyone have a document saying that Washington was appointed by God? And what I say to my students, I say, there's nothing wrong. Maybe one of those 90% that raised your hand. I say, you know, off the record, if we're sitting down having a conversation in a cafe, I said, off the record, as a professional historian. As a professional historian, I've never put that down in writing. On a personal level, Reverend Dr. Lewis, we're sitting around having a cupcake. I might agree with you. But here's the thing. As a historian, I never print that. I don't have a document for it. Therefore, it does not qualify as a historic statement. When I say to my students, I say, that's a statement of faith. And that's okay. That faith is an important part of the human experience. And there's nothing wrong with having statements of faith. But that we need to differentiate ourselves when it comes to the social sciences. One of the other things here is we also start talking about ideas of correlations. The example I use with this, if you've ever heard of a group called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, they're also referred to as the Pastafarians. And what they argue what's gone wrong with humanity is that global warming is a very real thing. But it's the great flying spaghetti monster who was cursing humanity with global warming. Because what they say is that as we decrease the number of pirates on the planet, that the temperature of the planet has been going up. And there's a direct correlation. That if we had more pirates on the planet, well, the great flying spaghetti monster would save us all. Now here's the problem with that. Is this is a piece of evidence they use to tell the story of the flying spaghetti monster. And once again, I don't have a problem with a Pastafarian having a statement of faith like that, but is that science? It's a cool picture, but that doesn't qualify as science. What we also try and do here, within the classroom, in the readings, I try and have my students read the ideas from the far right, the far left, and then when I come into the classroom, I try and spend as much time seeing if we can find a middle ground and some ideas that can link these students together. We can't always do it, but we at least attempt it every time here. When we talk about the American Revolution, we talk about Larry Schweiker's ideas, very traditional ideas about the American Revolution, saying the entire idea of the American Revolution is the United States is rooted in unique ideas about freedom, the individual, the role of religion, the role of ideas. And he presents some pretty good ideas here in his own book supporting those things. If you look at Howard Zinn, being a leftist, not a big surprise, executive in economic analysis, talking about the rise of capitalism. One of the unique things that Howard Zinn's going to talk about here is talking about the American Revolution as an example of class conflict, because he's going to say that rich people didn't want to pay their taxes. So what did they do? They went out and they got poor people to go fight that revolution. And once that revolution was won, who got the right to vote? Now, it's not until the year 1919 when we passed, great historian here, when we passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, sorry for the numbers, that everyone in the United States has the full right to vote. In the early days of the Republic, there were stipulations based upon property qualifications. It's a controversial way of looking at it, but there's good evidence to support it. What I try and do is I try and link this stuff together. We'll talk about the ideas of equality. We talk about ideas of class, but I also put in big perspective the fact that I'm in a degree in European history as well. Let's talk about the fact that what Americans are dealing with is being stuck between a bunch of European empires. And we try and look at it from multiple perspectives and understand it from a global view, an economic viewpoint, an idealistic viewpoint, which gives my students a fuller understanding of what's going on with the American Revolution. One of the other things I often try and do is we'll have different trivia questions in my class to see if kids can figure things out for themselves. We'll see if anyone can answer the correct answer to this question. Little religious trivia here. It says, this religion was founded in the wake of a spiritual revival by a young common man who was visited by an angel with a special mission to translate a holy book. This new text would supplement the Bible to provide an alternative interpretation of the life and teachings of Jesus, the path to eternal salvation, and the importance of the family structure. The early followers of this religion were heavily persecuted and fled to desert regions for safety. The early success of this religion relied almost completely on the dedication of missionaries. Who can tell me, what prophet is this and what religion?
Muhammad.
Sorry, what was that?
Muhammad.
It's the story of the prophet Joseph Smith. But it is also the story of the prophet Muhammad. And what we try and utilize with stuff like that is to see for kids to be able to bridge connections about the different things. In particular, using that as an example to understand what the experience was like during the 19th century of being a Mormon in the United States. Because the experience of a Mormon in the United States in the 19th century is very different than the experience of being a Mormon in the 20th century. During the 19th century, I mean, why did Mormons end up in Utah? I mean, every place they tried to settle, they assassinated your prophets, they burnt down your temples, and eventually you ended up out here in Utah. And what we're going to see here is what I try and do, is to bridge connections there and try and see if we can get students to think about things on a larger scale. One of the other things I try and do here is bring in a little sense of humor every once in a while. This is always an awkward story to try and tell because it's my wife sitting here, Elizabeth Booth. I married into the Booth family. But the point I try and make with this, I say to students, I say, when you think about Abraham Lincoln, less to do with the reality of Lincoln's life, and more to do with this guy right here. I said, you know, because what's the issue with Lincoln? Right before the war's over, what happens? Old John Wilkes comes in, takes out the president. Immediately after that, we're going to abolish things like slavery. And therefore, Lincoln becomes a martyr of the American Civil War, and we associate him with the end of slavery in the United States, because it's one of the things related with the legacy of Lincoln. But what I also point out is that Lincoln was a politician. He adapted to the political climate around him, and his attitudes about things changed over the years. If you look at this speech that Abraham Lincoln gave in 1858, it probably doesn't sound much like Lincoln. It says, "I am not now, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social or political equality of the white and black races. I am not now, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold offices, nor of intermarriage with white people. There's a physical difference between the white and the black races, which will forever forbid the two races living together on social or political equality. There must be a position of superior and inferior. I'm in favor of assigning the superior position to the white man." Doesn't sound much like the Lincoln I grew up with. But in context here, 1858. Can anyone tell me who he's running for U.S. Senate against? Stephen Douglas, the Democratic candidate from Illinois, who was a blatant racist. So what do you do as Abraham Lincoln? Well, you try and steal some of the guy's voters by taking some of his own language that he's used on race relations. Lincoln was a great hero of mine. He's on my belt buckle right now. He's also a politician. I need to identify him as a historic character, as a politician, but also a man who changed greatly over time. If you look at Lincoln here in 1862, 1 year into the American Civil War, he says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery, about the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intended no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere to be free." So when I ask students, why did you fight the American Civil War? When they say, well, we fought it to fight slavery, to bring an end to it. If you go back and you ask President Lincoln here in 1862, did he say he's doing it to fight slavery? No, he says he's doing it to save the Union. But what he also says here is he says on a personal level, I despise slavery. Yeah, I'd love to see it gone. But as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, my role right now is to try and bring this nation together. And it's not the slavery issue. But by the year 1863, after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, it becomes part of the war aims, and slavery does become a central issue. And this is the type of words we're more familiar with Lincoln. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that's the Lincoln we all know. But it's